Neal, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you here with us today and excited to hear what you have to tell us about the Department of Education. So we're going to turn it over to you for some opening comments and then go to questions.
Great. Thanks for having me on. I'm always happy to talk about this topic, and it is something I've worked on for decades, but boy, has it become a big issue once again. Not maybe a total shock, but certainly gratifying to see that we could talk again about why we should or should not have a U.S. Department of Education. What I'm going to do real fast, I think, is I'm just going to first with the history of the Department of Education. I think it's always easiest to understand why something exists when you know the history behind it. I'll talk a little bit about what it does, what the department has done, what will happen if we get rid of it, and then I will end with why it's unconstitutional, to kind of leave that, I hope, as sort of the last thought that people have of what I talk about in these prepared remarks. So a little bit about Department of Education history. The first thing you should know is probably the whole history of American education. And for the vast majority of America's history, of the United States history, there was no U.S. Department of Education. You can go up to 1867 and there was no federal involvement at all. In that year, there was creation of, very briefly, a Department of Education that was primarily tasked with collecting data. And it was quickly, within a year or two, downgraded to basically an office. And it had 4 employees. And the person who was put in charge of it said, boy, this is not what I had in mind. And he left. And so from about 1867 to the 1960s, there was very little federal involvement in education. And the reason is that almost nobody thought the federal government should have any sort of significant role in education. It did some things, but for the most part, people thought this is something for the states and local governments and for families. And I'll talk about the constitutional reasons, as I said at the end of these remarks. So you get to the 1960s, and it's only then that the federal government starts to take on a role in education, in particular K through 12 education. It's part of the war on poverty. So if you know your kind of electoral history, you know that the Democrats had a major victory in 1964. They take the presidency, they take a lot of Congress. And one of the things that President Johnson really wants to do is have this war on poverty. Also known as the Great Society. And it's a whole lot of social programs and social spending through the federal government. And one of the focuses is education. So this is where you get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is most recently called the Every Student Succeeds Act. It's where you get the Higher Education Act. A little bit before it comes the Head Start program. But these are major federal interventions in education, but they're mainly focused on spending. The idea is to have compensatory funding, mainly to help low-income districts or areas to sort of equalize resources. What you see is sort of a growing concern over the next 15 years or so of, well, we're spending this money, are we getting anything for it? And you start to see more ideas of, well, should we have standards and testing that are associated with this money? And you also have a change in teacher associations becoming unions. There's one association called the American Federation of Teachers that has long been an actual union committed to labor operation and labor organization. But you have a bigger organization called the National Education Association, which is now the largest teachers union in the United States. And I think actually, if you set aside the AFL-CIO, the largest union overall. And it goes from being a professional association dominated by principals and superintendents to a true labor union dominated by teachers. And in 1974, it says, we will put our support behind a presidential candidate who says they will create a federal Department of Education, a national cabinet level Department of Education. And then candidate Jimmy Carter, who was the governor of Georgia and not a particularly well-known politician, says he'll do that. So he ends up getting the NEA's support. He gets elected, and he drags his feet for about 15 months or so, not working to create this department. And then the NEA starts to say, hey, you said you'd create a cabinet level Department of Education. What's going on? Why aren't you doing this? So he starts to work to get that done. There's actually bipartisan opposition to it. The president of the American Federation of Teachers, so that other teachers union, Albert Shanker, says this is a bad idea. We don't want the federal government having the power to micromanage education. You have people like Senator Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, saying you don't want to have the federal government micromanaging education. And so there's a lot of opposition. It takes a lot of votes, many of which are very close, but ultimately the Department of Education is created. And so from basically 1980 on, in fact, May 4th, so coming up, will be the Department of Education's 45th birthday, we have a Department of Education. But understand, you draw the beginning of the country to 1776, it's not till 1980, so more than 200 years later, that we have this Department of Education. Well, what does it do? Again, mainly its focus is compensatory funding. A lot of that is at the K through 12 level. You've probably heard of something called Title I, which is of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It's basically money that goes to school districts based on their level of income. It also, though, many people don't realize that this is basically the biggest thing it does is it is the nation's student lender for college students. It dominates funding, or at least student loans, for higher education. The biggest employment it has is people doing that. So it is actually, people have said, it's really a bank with a policy shop connected. It is really a big lender. It also, though, has an Office of Civil Rights, or for Civil Rights, rather, that does civil rights enforcement to try and keep school districts or states from discriminating in their provision of education. So that's kind of the history. That's kind of what it does. What happens if it goes away? Well, what's being discussed in Washington are two possibilities, but one is really predominant. One possibility is we stop doing all the things the department does, and as I'll say in a minute, most of that is unconstitutional. But the more politically realistic idea is you take the parts and move it elsewhere. So student loans would go to the Department of Treasury or the Small Business Administration. Office for Civil Rights would its job would be subsumed in the other department that does civil rights, the Department of Justice. And then money that goes to states would be block granted. Basically, lots of different programs would be consolidated into one or two sets of dollars that then are distributed to school districts. It could be based on income levels in the district, could be on the percentage of kids who have disabilities, but block granted, not through a whole bunch of different streams of money. And then the last thing is, why is it unconstitutional? It's unconstitutional because the federal government, through the Constitution, is given only specific enumerated powers. Those are the only ones it has, and education is not among them. So student aid is not constitutional. Aid to school districts is not constitutional. However, civil rights enforcement is constitutional. In fact, I would say something the federal government is supposed to do through the 14th Amendment. But even that, it has typically overreached and over-investigated, seeking out problems. And I think if we were to move all civil rights enforcement in the Department of Justice, which does have, again, a legitimate constitutional role, you'd see a lot less of that overreach. So the reality is, why have states and school districts and hopefully increasingly families dominated education? Because they're the ones that constitutionally are supposed to. The federal government has no authority to do these things.
Well, that's great. Wonderful opening comments. I know Janine has got a lot of questions. So Janine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes.
Janine, we can't hear you. We did hear you briefly. We lost sound. That's so strange.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can now.
I don't know. This microphone gives me trouble. Okay, Neal McCluskey, thank you so much. I really, that was a very strong analysis, and you have a wonderful voice, by the way.
Well, I can't take any credit for that other than I try to drink the right stuff.
There you go. Well, it's a very, very commanding, your appearance and your voice. So thank you for that analysis, and we've always really appreciated the Cato Institute as well. Wow, where to begin? I mean, it's not constitutional, so if it's not constitutional, how did it get passed in the first place? That's my first question.
Oh, so that's an excellent question. It could take up a whole lot of time. But basically, there's been a theory that I think is inaccurate that the federal government can't directly do something that it's not given constitutional authority to do. So like we'd say the federal government can't go and run schools in a state. But there's this idea that if the federal government funds something, it can take control through that funding. And if states or school districts don't want to follow that control, they don't want to follow what a Department of Education does, they would say, well, we're not taking the money. So I think the theory is, well, the Department of Education is okay because it gives out money and it doesn't try and actually run education except through that money. And people said, and you could go back to Alexander Hamilton, probably, I would hold him responsible for this, but to say, well, so the federal government is allowed to spend and then control through spending, and it can spend on things that it isn't actually given direct authority to run.
So it becomes a question of, if you want our money, you have to do what we tell you.
Yes, I don't think that's correct. I think that the spending power and the taxing power exists to give the federal government the revenue it needs to execute its specific enumerated powers and nothing else. But that is unfortunately not how the courts have tended to interpret it.
Right, right. I was talking about regarding to, from what I gathered, in regard just specifically to the Department of Education. Once it was passed, it was like, well, we're going to give you money and we're not going to tell you what to do, but you're going to get our money if you don't do what we want you to do. Is that
Yes.
correct?
And there are actually laws that say, for instance, the Department of Education can't try and affect your curriculum, but clearly it does. And around 2010, we had a big dispute about something called the Common Core, where the Department of Education was saying, if you want our money, not only you have to be part of No Child Left Behind, which said you have to have uniform state standards and uniform state tests and hold all schools accountable based on those standards and tests. And then they said a little later, if you want that money, you also have to use something called the Common Core, which were curricular standards. So the federal government has not only disregarded the Constitution, for a while it was even disregarding the laws that created the department. So we have unfortunately in Washington often not felt bound by either the Constitution or the laws that have been passed.
I think that's been the problem with big government all along, getting involved in states and in people's lives. It's like, well, if you want our money, then we have the power. And that's duplicitous and that's not constitutional, as I think we're all agreeing. Wow. Well, so that's really interesting. And Common Core was a failure. Can we not, wasn't it really? I mean, because I tell you, I taught for school for a year. I give a lot of speeches in schools. And also I had a daughter who went through, I still do, but she went through all the, the school system. And the more regulated government became by the federal government with all of these things, the less creative a teacher could be, the less time a teacher had to create their own curriculum, the less one-on-one, because it was just this sort of dictate from Big Brother up above. And everybody became rather frantic and focused on these tests. And then the children become bogged down with, oh my God, it's all about testing. And there became this inordinate pressure because they wouldn't get their money if they didn't do it. And I think that we lost a lot of creativity, a lot of one-on-one impassioned teacher-student sort of educational scholastic relationships because of this pressure.
Yeah, Common Core was sort of a mixed bag. It was bad in what it intended to do, but the unintended political consequences actually were kind of good. So it was bad in that the intent was to standardize education across the country, which makes no sense because one, nobody is omniscient, and we don't know what is the right way to educate. It's certainly the Common Core people didn't. One of the major debates about Common Core was, Is it teaching math right? Is it teaching English right? So that was one of the problems. And then it sort of ignored the fact that all kids and all families and all communities are different. There is no one way to teach. The silver lining was there was massive opposition to Common Core. Unfortunately, it didn't coalesce until Common Core was already at school districts and getting into schools. And that's when the public became aware that this thing was suddenly taking over their schools, and they really didn't like it. And so unfortunately, it was already the tentacles were partially in the school system, but people got so angry that I've never seen this before. The federal government actually withdrew somewhat from education because not only were parents mad at the Common Core, but the Obama administration tried to connect teacher evaluations to it. And then you had teachers unions opposed. So you had libertarians, conservatives, teachers unions, teachers all saying enough is enough. And when we reauthorized the No Child Left Behind Act to the Every Student Succeeds Act, it actually got rid of something called adequate yearly progress, which was how the federal government would punish schools that didn't do well enough. And that was a huge disengagement of the federal government from control. And I never thought I'd see that. And so that federal overreach caused such a backlash, we actually reduced how much the federal government was micromanaging.
Interesting, because, you know, obviously that's why federalism is so important in local government, community government, and PTAs and parent teacher associations and things of that nature. Because, I mean, what someone's going to want in Texas is going to be very different than what they want in Utah or Maine or California. You know, that's we're such a big country. That's why we need the federalism. Every teacher knows, and that our school district knows what is best and how you're going to reach their kids. It's really interesting. Well, my last question for you is, before I pass to my comrades here, is why the failure in our teaching, where math and English is so low statistically, and that these kids are they can't read or write in third grade, but they're passed on to the next grade, the next grade, the next grade. Where's the failure in this?
Yeah, so there are a lot of factors involved, and I don't want to pretend like there's just one. A lot of what happens in education and leads to our outcomes is actually outside of the education system. So some of the results we get are cultural. Americans tend to be much more focused on creativity and outside the box thinking than things that are easily tested. So you see international exams, you say, well, why are we so much lower than other countries? Fortunately, we don't focus on simple things like testing or what is testable as much as other places. So there's some of that. The other problem, though, is we have an education system that is top down. Instead of funding students the way Milton Friedman talked about, where the public may be or the government may fund education, but they don't also fund free public schools. They fund students, and then they choose schools, and the schools are autonomous and they compete. Instead of having that bottom-up dynamism, we have this top-down system where basically government says everybody will get X. It was better when it was a bunch of school districts that were the top-down deliverers because at least they could reflect unique communities. It gets worse when you have the state dictate to those school districts because you can't as easily then tailor what the district does to the unique communities. And the worst thing is when the federal government gets involved. And for, basically from 2002 to about 2015, the federal government was driving everything. It created the basic structure of the education system where it was all based on standardized tests and sort of incentivizing actually gaming those tests where you'd learn testing strategies and things like that. And you'd spend months just focused on test prep and kind of like cramming. Yeah, you might do well on that test, but you haven't actually learned it. You've just prepared for that moment, and then you kind of brain dump it. And I think that we've had that kind of system for too long. And what we've seen is the research on school choice. So that bottom up leads to much more lasting academic benefits, reflected not just in tests, but in also longer term things like educational attainment, college graduation, and things like that.
That's well said. And I think that my daughter was in Montessori school, up until about second grade, where you actually put your fingers in the sand and you learn to draw on this everything. If you're learning math, you're actually tactile, you're touching it, you're understanding how the division works, and in that way it was really embedded in the brain, and they weren't worried about any test scores. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so it's I think we've lost that kind of fundamental joy of learning instead of
Hmm.
pressure of learning, as well as creative ways to learn. But I'm going to pass now because my time is up, but thank you very much, Mr. McCluskey. And Jewel, you're on.
Thank you.
Thank
Hello
you.
and thank you. I'm Jewel Gilbert here and happy to be on talking about something that we are all passionate about is education. That's so much of the reason why we're involved with this great organization and happy to have you on. So I want to talk about the constitutionality a little bit. Um, I'm always so I'm always so interested in that we want to fix things. We have these uh, areas of the country that we want to improve. And so often on this show, we get down to that a lot of the things we complain about are things that we also have a pretty strong claim are unconstitutional in some way or other. Could you just touch on again, um, in a like quick, simple way, how is the Department of Education? How could we, why you believe that elements of the DOE are unconstitutional?
Yeah, I'd say almost all of it is. So, again, when we think of the Constitution, we need to think first and foremost, or keep in mind that the Constitution gives only certain specific powers to the federal government. Everything else it does not have. The idea was to not have a powerful federal government except in explicit areas where it was believed that you had to have national action. But if you read, for instance, James Madison, he says, look, what the federal government does is almost always external facing, so dealing with other countries or tariffs or something like that. Everything else is with states or the people, and that's almost all internal. And so there was never any intention to have a national Department of Education or national, like federal education policy at all, because the expectation was, and the desire and the belief was all that sort of thing should be local. And we followed that for most of our history. Um, but I think you see education along with a lot of other areas where well-intentioned people said, well, we've got problems. It seems to be national. So let's just have the federal government try and fix it. And I think many just sort of said the Constitution's kind of old and it's getting in the way of things we want to do. So we're kind of going to kind of ignore it. And we've seen that that's been bad. It just leads to all kinds of waste. It takes power away from the people closest to the kids it's supposed to serve. And good intentions and the same as good policy. And so we need to go back to following this document that was very carefully thought out that said what makes sense to do on a national level and what makes sense to have decentralized. And a Department of Education is even worse than having federal policy. It says we're going to essentially create like an education czar or a national superintendent by creating this department that's also cabinet level, which means it's essentially direct access to the president. Nothing like that could ever be seen as acceptable when you actually read the Constitution and you look at the specific enumerated powers that are given to the federal government. Education simply isn't amongst them. And I always have to note, people will say, well, what about the General Welfare Clause? But the General Welfare Clause, as Madison has written in the Federalist Papers, only explains why the specific powers that follow it are given. He has said explicitly, or he said explicitly, the General Welfare Clause itself doesn't confer any power. If it did, why even bother with the specific enumerated powers that follow?
That's an excellent point. I want to highlight that for the listeners and myself. A quick understanding of the General Welfare Clause, which I'm sure that comes up in everybody's questions once you have any type of a spirited discussion about the Constitution. So I'll definitely be noting that section. So moving from that, we have, I work in schools often, and with Constituting America, I've given some of the Constitution workshops, and you know anyone that works with students and has a passion for it, I know that Wyatt also is interested in being a teacher. The teaching is awesome. Students are awesome. There is definitely a marked change in our students' ability to understand the world and think from what could be called like a first principle sense. There, there's with so much more information, there's a lot less of ability even for them to parse through it. And we see with the Common Core method a real fracturing of subjects, treating every subject as if it's completely separate and coming up with these new ways to learn about these subjects. It was very strange. You know, I lived through it. I was homeschooled, but I saw it in my friends and I heard it was all around the debate. So my question is that for the Department of Education, they directly implemented the way that we are teaching our students across the board. Mostly, like I know that school boards have a lot of power, but these directives come down from the Department of Education attached to funding, and then that funding is like a bully stick to the schools. Or how do they? Is it because of the Department of Education that we have our modern philosophy of schooling, and do they coerce that?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't say it's because of the federal government that we have our modern philosophy of schooling, because that is built up over many decades and centuries. So, and a lot of the thought about, what's the right pedagogy and what's the right way to organize schools, some called progressive, some called conservative, a lot of that predates the federal government. It's only again really starting in the 1960s that the federal government starts to spend a lot of money in K through 12 education. And it's really not until the 1980s that it starts to say, well, wait a minute, we need to start attaching some rules and outcomes measures to that money. So, it depends how far you want to get into this, but 1983, well, I should say, actually, this is good history. So 1979, Congress passes the legislation that creates the department. 1980, on May 4th, the department comes into existence. Ronald Reagan runs in part on getting rid of this Department of Education. In 1981, he takes office and he basically sort of canvasses senators, because Republicans take over the Senate, and says, well, what do you think of revisiting this and eliminating the department? And basically, the Republican senator said, we don't want to go back into this fight. We've already had it. And so the thing sort of stays. And the second Secretary of Education is actually kind of a fan of the department. And he commissions a report that eventually becomes the A Nation at Risk report. And it famously says, if a foreign power had done to us what we've done to ourselves with our education system, we'd have considered it an act of war. And it gets everybody in America really worried. And then the next Secretary of Education is a guy named Bill Bennett, who you might know. Still, he used to have a radio show. I think he had a TV show too. But and he really is this big personality who rails against how bad the education system is. And people start to look at him for sort of like bully pulpit kind of leadership. And then you have a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that starts to say, well, if you're getting our money, you have to start having tests that show kids are learning. And that builds up to finally in 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act. And it is then that the federal government says, okay, we're kind of going to take control of how this works. You have to have uniform state standards, uniform state tests. You have to test all students, and you have to have every student and subsets of students making what's called adequate yearly progress to full proficiency, everybody proficient in math and reading by 2014. We know that's not going to happen. You get to around 2009, 2010, we have what's called the Great Recession, and the federal government, as it often does, accretes power when there's a quote-unquote crisis. So it says we're going to bail out a whole bunch of the economy, and a small part of this is we're giving money to the Secretary of Education to give to school districts, but with his rules attached. And he's the one who says, this is Arne Duncan as the secretary, if you want to compete for this money and win, you have to adopt a set of curricular standards common to a majority of states and tests common to a majority of states. And by the way, we'll choose those tests and pay for those tests. And we know there's only one consortium called the Common Core coming up with these standards. So de facto, the federal government then is dictating at the very least the standards that put a box around what curricula you can teach. And so it's only over time that it starts to take control. And then, as I said, actually that kind of implodes because finally the American public's like, we've had it. federal government with you telling us what to do in education. So we're now at a point where we still have vestiges of it left, but it is back to more state and local control.
Wow, that was a amazing history you just shoved in there together and concisely. Thank you so much. It is surprising that, I mean, you talk about those standards that were chosen at the time for Common Core, and kind of what my question was getting at was, when did the American people get a say on what those standards were? When did we figure out that this is something that school district to school district was good for, our students? And I think your answer is we didn't. But thank you
Yes.
so much. I got pass it on.
So I wrote a paper on this national standards movement, and then nobody read the paper, and I thought, well, oh, well, I tried. And I knew Common Core had been part of the Race to the Top program, which was this federal program. And then I was sort of surprised when we started to see in school districts around the country, parents kind of revolting against it. But that was already after it was partially in the schools. And so parents and community members didn't get a say until it was a little bit too late. But they were able to stop it from kind of fully taking over the education system.
That's a positive note for us to take, though, that they could. I want to pass it on to Wyatt, and thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Jewel, and thank you, Neal, for being here today. It's fascinating discussion. Especially because as a future teacher too, I'm already learning a whole lot. So my first question, so you've talked a lot about how this funding turned into things that sort of had strings attached to it. Um, but when you look at the funding itself, I mean, I was reading a report that said in 2022, 15% of special education's funding was federally funding. Um, Education for the disadvantaged, 19% of it was federally funded. And a lot of this, about nearly 50% of all federal spending on public schools, come from the Department of Education. And I know a lot of people are concerned that if this department's dismantled or it's taken away, then what's going to happen to those fundings and what will happen to those projects that do heavily rely on the funding from the Department of Ed.
Yeah, so I don't think that, at least the data I've seen, is the federal government provides about 10%. It varies from year to year, but over the last few decades, it's about 10% of all K through 12 funding. It supplies a lot more funding in higher ed, but in a different way. So in K through 12, it is mainly this formula funding to school districts that goes through states. So the one for kids with disadvantages, or call it Title I as part of the law. That's the biggest tranche of money. I should remember exactly what it is, but it's about 18 billion last I saw. The second largest is for kids with disabilities. It comes from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was about 14.2 billion, I think, last I saw. But these are actually very small numbers relative to the total amount spent on K through 12 education. So again, it comes out to about 10% of all funding. Plus, there are all these little categorical programs that are all, $500 million or something like that, or 10 million. It depends on the program. So the federal government could go away, and you'd basically see a 10% reduction in spending, except if the federal government goes away, it stops being involved in K through 12 education. We'll just focus on that for now. And we cut taxes proportionate to that amount that it is of the federal budget. Well, then that's just money that stays with families who could then spend it on education. So it isn't actually a loss. It's a loss maybe of stuff coming from Washington, but it's more at the very local level of families and communities, which is where we should want that. We have to remember that when money goes to the Department of Education, you pay taxes, it gets processed by the IRS, and then goes to the Department of Education. They have people who process it, they attach rules and regulations to it, and then they send it back down through a bureaucratic system, which burns off money in ways that are not educationally useful. So we'd be better off, I think, if money stayed just where it was with families. That said, the focus that I have seen in Washington for what will be done or what people would like to do with the Department of Education isn't actually to eliminate funding. It is just to move parts out of the department so that we at least don't have this clearly unconstitutional cabinet level department. And they'd say, let's still have the money funding for the disadvantaged. Let's have Health and Human Services be in charge of that. Let's still do the student aid, but let's have the Treasury Department run it. And so there isn't much talk about decreasing funding. And even if it's not just about moving parts, there's also, well, let's just block grant it so you don't have all these little programs that are lots more bureaucracy than you need to get money to states and districts.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. And then I was also reading one of your other articles. I feel like you've kind of touched on this, and you talked about, let me pull up my notes, this bill that Senator, where did I put it? Yeah, Senator Mike Rounds had proposed. You were talking about supporting that bill. I was just wondering if you could discuss what that bill is, what it entails, and how it would achieve some of its main objectives.
Well, the first thing I should say is there's a new version of that bill, and I
Oh,
haven't had a
okay.
chance to really dig into it, so I'll talk about the old version. I think the
Mm-hmm.
new version is probably similar but more refined. And so generally what it does is kind of what I just described. At least the original bill was move a lot of parts of the Department of Education elsewhere. I think the original bill didn't necessarily have all the parts going where they would make the most sense, and I think they probably changed that. But move a lot of it and then consolidate programs for block granting. And I think that that would be a big improvement in what we have now. I don't think it would still fit the constitutional bill. The constitutional bill is the federal government doesn't do any of these things, but it is movement in the right direction to dismantle this clearly unconstitutional education department and then try and decrease how much control the federal government exerts over the money that it is taken from people and then says, you want it back? You know, you follow our rules. The fewer rules it attaches, I think the better.
Yeah, and that was I can't remember if I said this, but Senator Mike Rounds from South Dakota, he had the one that proposed that bill. And then one of my last questions. So I was reading some of these statistics, and an overwhelming majority of Americans are dissatisfied with the American education system. I think the report that I saw had only 24%. So about 1 in 4 of Americans say we're satisfied with the public school system. However, many Americans still believe that the Department of Education should either stay where it's at or be expanded. So I was just kind of wondering if you could maybe share your thoughts on why is there this divide between an overwhelming majority of people who are dissatisfied with the system but still want to keep the Department of Education or even enlarge it or make it bigger?
Yeah, this is one of the many great contradictions you see when you look at polling and survey data
Hmm.
of, you know, why are people so unhappy with the system, but they want the federal government to be involved? Although you often find survey data that says they want the last group of people to be in charge of education is the federal government. I
Hmm.
think that a lot of the support from the for the Department of Education comes from people not actually knowing what the department does and because it has the word education in it. And most people who don't have time to delve into politics the way I do, they say, look, education is good. The more money put into something good, the more of that good thing I can get. So, of course, I would want the federal government to have a Department of Education. And I don't know that they associate the Department of Education necessarily with delivering all the bad outcomes they see in the system. Although many people also think, because they hear it a lot, that, well, the reason we don't do well is we don't spend enough money on education, even though we've more than doubled in real terms what we spend per pupil over the last few decades. So it's been almost unremitting increases in spending, but people look at it that way. And then there's going beyond sort of the constitutional stuff, there's an interesting split. So you've probably heard people say, well, you know, we hate Congress, but I really like my congressman. You know, you don't like the way this system works because the system is hard, but you like the person you know. And there's a lot of that in education. So most people say, I really don't like the way the education system works, but I really kind of like my school district. And I think there's some of that involved too, where they say, well, the system sounds bad, but I kind of like what my schools are doing. And if I had more money coming from the federal government or anywhere else, the schools I like could do more stuff that I like. The ones we should really be worried about are, you know, the 25% or so or 30% of people say, ugh, my local school is terrible or my school district is terrible and I need something else. That's a school choice issue, I think, which is also very important. At the state level, you should have funding follow students to any school they want, not you just directly fund public schools. And then I think you'd see a lot more people empowered to get what they think is best. But when you see people say they don't like the system, it doesn't actually mean they are dissatisfied with the education they're getting. And it doesn't mean they don't want the Department of Education to give them more money.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. That's very, very informative. And I will pass it on back to Kathy. So thank you so much, Neal.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Jorn and Wyatt and Janine. It's been a great show so far. And Neal, we're just so glad that we have you on. Your answers are very, very enlightening. And we've got a lot of audience questions to bring up. But first, we want to take a moment and recognize our teachers and students who are watching today. We want to thank Michelle Weissman, who's on with students. We want to thank D'Angela Hines, who's on with students. And we want to thank student Kenyon Wanas, who is listening in California. So thank you to all the teachers and students. If you're a teacher or student in our audience and I didn't give you a shout out, just drop your name in the Q&A and we'll be sure and do that before the end of the show. We also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to those listening in Las Vegas. We're going to start with Rick Mayberry's question. Rick says, thank you. This is terrific. I think most would agree that a solid education is a foundation for a healthy, sustained, and growing democracy. Constituting America is an example of a critical asset to our nation. So thank you, Rick, for that. But Rick goes on to ask, that being said, what would be the federal government's legal path to correct a broken or bad situation in education? For example, if a state consistently graduates students who can't read at an acceptable level, has a high school dropout rate, or lacks the fundamentals of a successful life, or if the situation is more rampant across many states, is there anything the federal government can legitimately do?
It would depend on the circumstances, but for the most part, I would say there isn't anything the federal government can do other than if it is a clear violation of civil rights. So if you find, as we found in the 50s and 60s, that school districts or states were intentionally segregating students based on race or intentionally providing lesser education based on all sorts of group memberships, then the federal government does have a responsibility to step in and say, state, this is illegal, and then take action against the state to change it. But bad outcomes is not something that the federal government can just say, well, we're not happy with the outcomes we're getting. We don't think the test scores are high enough, so we're going to intervene and try and fix it. The Constitution just doesn't give it a power that says, well, in the event a state doesn't get good test scores, the federal government shall take over the education system of the state. There's nothing like that in there. And I think it's a practical matter. We can look at federal intervention since the 1960s and say, well, okay, the federal government actually runs something called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a national exam, which is probably also unconstitutional, but one of the less offensive things the federal government does. But what it has shown for its entire existence is we get maybe, if we're lucky, 40% or so of kids to proficiency in reading and math. The scores tend to go up and down, but I can't think of a time it was higher than that. Maybe it hit 50% at some point, and that's it. And that's been with massive federal intervention. And if you look at sort of the trend has been stagnant for the most part, especially for high school seniors, basically 17-year-olds or 12th graders, depending on the exam. Despite huge increases in spending, despite huge increases in sort of quality of life, so GDP has gone up per person, per capita, significantly in this time, and yet we have these stagnant scores. So I don't see that the federal government has demonstrated an ability to improve things, even if it had the constitutional authority to try to do that, which I don't think it has.
It sounds like the best recourse is for we the people to step up and elect new local school board leaders and state leaders if they're unhappy with the progress the state is making.
And I would just say, because I have to, school choice. Every state, I think, should have programs where the money follows the kids. And then you have real bottom-up power for families to say, I'm not happy with what I'm getting, I'm going somewhere else. And you need to couple that with autonomy for educators to run schools as they see fit. And then you let the two sides come together and then they pull in the same direction. And that tends to get better outcomes.
Definitely. Julianne Smith asks, have there been any SCOTUS decisions or lower court decisions that would defend or support dismantling the Department of Education, or are there cases that would support maintaining it?
Yeah, so I always forget the whole name of this case, but it was Nebraska v. Dole, I believe. And it basically said that the federal government can attach rules and regulations and do things that it spends money on as long as it doesn't try to directly control basically entities it doesn't have constitutional authority to control. It can control them through money. So the federal government can't just go to a school district and say, well, your curriculum is bad, so we're gonna change it, or we don't like your discipline policies. But if they take federal money and all school districts get federal money, then the federal government can take control. And that case, I don't believe has been revisited. That, I think, is what would have to be broken, is the Supreme Court saying, no, the federal government can't attach a bunch of rules to the money it spends. And even better would be a ruling that said the federal government can't spend on things that it doesn't already have constitutional authority to be involved in.
Thank you. And Hope Mucklow has an interesting question. She asks, is there a correlation between the rising costs of higher education and the creation of the Department of Education?
I wouldn't necessarily say there's a correlation with the creation of the department. I say there is a correlation between the creation of student aid programs and then these and the increase in the cost of college. I have somewhere in the many things I've written on the Cato website, there's a chart I made one time that basically shows the increase in student aid and costs with lines for the years when the federal government did various things. The federal government started to get involved in student aid, actually, I think it was the 40s and 50s, with sort of institution-based lending. It grows lending, it grows Pell Grants and lots of other things over time. The 60s, of course, is a big point for this. And so it had been involved in basically funding students in higher ed for a long time, even before, or at least decades before, the Department of Education. So I don't think the department itself, that its existence is what drives this correlation between spending and aid. I think it is aid that preceded the department, and then certainly we've added a bunch to it. But that aid clearly enables colleges to raise their prices. Basically, if the college is going to charge you X and you don't have money for it, then the federal government gives you money. They're like, okay, well, now we can charge you X, and then next year we'll raise it to X plus 1, and you'll say, federal government, I need more money, and you start a vicious cycle. So, and the department has certainly been part of, I think, often efforts to try and keep these programs, even though we know they're counterproductive.
Well, thank you. And Karen Pecor asks a question about who is working at the Department of Education. Karen says, I sure would like to know how many real teachers who've had experience in the classroom are actually now or have ever previously been employed in the Department of Education. In my 44 years of actively being involved in the classroom, coaching, and athletic directing, I personally only see a pipeline from universities rather than from the teaching profession.
Yes, so I should say first, I haven't seen a breakdown of how many people who work at the Department of Education have been teachers, but I know enough about the department that I can say first and foremost, the biggest thing it does is run student loan programs. And so that's not about having teachers do anything about teaching. That's about essentially running a bank or a lending entity. Until recently, there were about 4,200 Department of Education employees. You probably know that the Trump administration slashed that by about half. 1,200 of those worked in the Office of Student Aid. And then most of what else the department does is not actually about teaching anybody. It certainly isn't in charge of giving direction on how to teach. It is more distribution of money. And so it wouldn't be surprising if most people in the department didn't have a teaching background, because most of what they're doing isn't teaching. It is running programs. So my guess would be more have administrative backgrounds and political backgrounds than have classroom experience.
Well, thank you for that. And Cher G asks, as a college teacher, I notice all my freshman students come in with very scripted ideas where they regurgitate equally. They don't question or change from the scripted learning to think for themselves. Is there any way more individual critical thinking could be allowed rather than prescribed test answering as a goal?
Well, I think the demise of the No Child Left Behind Act, you should start to see the results of that with some more critical thinking. So what was important was when the No Child Left Behind Act was reauthorized as the Elementary and Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, they removed the adequate yearly progress requirement, which really locked everybody into very strict standards and testing. The ESSA still has a standards and testing requirement, but far fewer schools would be punished basically if they didn't do well. It's the bottom 5 and 10% of performers. So you should still be seeing, or you're likely to still be seeing, students who are somewhat focused on standardized tests. And I think even before No Child Left Behind, schooling was often about, what do I have to do to get as good a grade as I can on this test? And even without the federal government, we had the SAT and the ACT and lots of exams. So it's not like we can only blame the federal government. But I think we've seen a decrease in the federal government requiring strict infatuation almost with standards and with testing. And you should, I think, start to see some more creative thinking. But I think a lot of that is going to come through the more we have school choice. So funding for students instead of the schools. There's been a big increase in school choice since COVID. So we recently passed the 1 million student mark, 1 million students, more than 1 million students going to private education, private schools through these government programs, state programs typically, not federal. And that is what will really unleash other ways of doing education. So the public schools tend to be put into a system that they actually had little control of eventually, which is standards and testing based. If you can choose something else, they can embrace creativity. So we're seeing lots of schools there like forest schools and Montessori schools and all sorts of out-of-the-box models that are starting to go to scale with school choice options.
Well, thank you. And I think we've got time for one last question. And we have a couple of audience members who are asking, realistically, will the Department of Education be closed? One of our members here says, how likely is it that politicians in Washington will really abolish the department? He notes that it didn't happen in President Trump's first term, but in the current term, it's being verbalized more. But then our audience member asked, but can that be done without consent from Congress, which seems unlikely? If the agency is truly unconstitutional, can the judiciary pull this off? Or is there some practical strategy that could restore fidelity to Article 1, Section 8? And then Julian Smith also notes that since the department was created by an act of Congress and there's not 60 votes in the Senate, how can it be closed formally rather than just relocating parts of it?
Yeah, well, so the first thing I think is to say, well, I'll start by saying there is a lot more focus on eliminating the department in the second Trump term than there was in the first. They did put out eventually a plan to combine the Department of Labor, I think, and Department of Education, but it was sort of a sidelight. There's much more direct focus on it now. And that is going to be beneficial no matter what, because we are back to having the discussions we need to have, which is, should we have a Department of Education? Should the federal government be involved in education? And is it constitutional? That said, I don't think if there were, say, a vote in Congress tomorrow to eliminate the department, that it would succeed, largely because you need to get 60 senators to overcome filibuster to pass anything other than budget reconciliation, which is a whole other animal, and it's not how you would get rid of the Department of Education. But there is a lot, I think, very clearly that the president can do. The president definitely has the authority to do as the president's been doing, which is to be in charge of hiring and firing, at least up to the point, at least conceptually, where they can't do the jobs Congress gave them anymore. And then I think it's also important, though, that we understand every office holder in Washington, the president and members of Congress, all take an oath to uphold the Constitution, and all should be saying, this is unconstitutional. Let's eliminate it. And I think that you are correct, though, that there's a lot of, the Congress did create the Department of Education. Congress created all these programs. It gives the Secretary jobs to do. I think it will be necessary for Congress to start withdrawing those things. But it is also the role of judges to say, is this constitutional? I think judges have allowed the federal government to do far more than the Constitution allows. You kind of go back to the 1930s and the switch in time staves 9 for how that happened. But I do think the current Supreme Court is much more inclined to be willing to rein in the federal government. The problem is you've got to get a lawsuit that makes it there. And I think that'll require probably some state saying, or maybe a school district, we're not taking your rules because you've taken our money, whether we like it or not, to do something unconstitutional, and we're sick of following your rules that are unconstitutional just to get our money back. But I haven't seen a state or school district that's about to do that.
Well, thank you. We're right at the top of the hour. This was a fascinating hour. We could have gone on, I think, for 2 or 3 more hours. We just thank you so much for your gift of time and wisdom to us this afternoon. And we want to thank all of our audience members and our great questions that y'all put forth today. And we invite everyone back next week to join us. We're going to be having a discussion on government regulation and just getting back to discussing what really are government regulations and how do they restrict our freedoms. And we're going to have Andrew Langer as our special guest. So we hope y'all will all join us next week. Thank you, Neal.
Thank you, Neal.
Thanks for having me. Thanks
Thank
for all the
you.
great questions.
Thank you. Bye.